Hello, my name is Egon Cholakian. In today's address, I will focus on two critically important topics of global significance. The first concerns a genuine geodynamic threat, the Siberian magma plume. If it erupts, it will result in a planetary-scale catastrophe that will affect not only Russia, but the entire world, with neighboring countries being particularly vulnerable. That is why today I will examine in detail the specific consequences this poses for Ukraine, its citizens, and the broader Eurasian region in the event of the Siberian Plume's activation. The second topic I wish to address is the alarming situation unfolding in Ukraine. Specifically, I will speak about certain individuals working for Russia's interest, whose actions obstruct the dissemination of accurate information about the threat posed by the Siberian Plume. In doing so, they create additional risk, both for Ukraine and for international security as a whole. In my previous address, I identified specific agents of influence operating in Ukraine in the interest of certain power circles within Russia. Today, I'm prepared to name a specific agent of influence and present public evidence of their collaboration with a state that is currently engaged in open military conflict with Ukraine. I am referring to individuals who, acting in Russia's interest, directly facilitated the fabrication of a criminal case against several participants of the ALLATRA Movement within the Ukrainian territory. It is widely known that ALLATRA has consistently studied the threat posed by the Siberian magma plume for over 20 years. For more than a decade, the movement has published scientifically substantiated data and proposed concrete, feasible solutions to address the issue. It is precisely this work that has provoked fierce resistance from particularly vested interest within the Russian government. Individuals for whom any public discussion of the Siberian threat is deeply inconvenient and who are determined to preserve silence around this issue in the public sphere. It was at their initiative that a discrediting campaign against ALLATRA was launched in Ukraine, carried out through Ukrainian agents of influence under their control. The issue at hand goes far beyond Ukraine's internal affairs. It concerns every person on the planet. That is because our collective future depends directly on how events in Ukraine unfold today and what decisions are made regarding the situation around the ALLATRA movement, and thus the dissemination of information about the Siberian magma plume. This is precisely why, in this address, I will give special attention to Ukraine, specifically to the actions of the aforementioned individuals who are working in the interest of Russian power structures while disguising their agenda as domestic Ukrainian narratives. The activities of such agents undermine not only Ukraine's national security, they endanger the security of the entire world by obstructing the flow of information on which the lives of millions depend. In the final part of my address, I want to speak to you, each of you, about your role in ensuring that the truth is brought to light. Without your involvement, humanity's chances of survival diminish to near zero. So let us begin by exposing the individuals, the names and surnames of Russian agents operating on Ukrainian soil. Let us answer the question, who in Ukraine is deliberately acting in Russia's interest by leading discrediting campaigns against ALLATRA and fabricating criminal cases against its participants? On whose orders is this being done? In my previous address, I informed you that a Russian agent is operating in Ukraine on behalf of RACIRS, the Russian Association of Centers for Religious and Sex Studies, a structure that advances the destructive interests of certain circles within the Russian government under the guise of religious and human rights rhetoric. After this information was made public, I received numerous inquiries. Who is this person? Who serves as the bridge between Russian forces and the harmful narratives that threaten Ukraine's national security? Today, I can provide a definitive answer to that question. I can do so because, as has been reliably confirmed, thanks to the professionalism, civic responsibility, and principled stance of Ukrainian law enforcement, a criminal case has been officially opened against this individual, this RACIRS agent operating within Ukraine. This became possible due to the vigilance and strategic foresight of the agencies responsible for national security. First and foremost, the Security Service of Ukraine. I extend my sincere gratitude to the SBU, the Office of the Prosecutor General, and all institutions safeguarding the state's security for their firm stance on this matter. I also personally thank Ukraine's President, Volodymyr Zelensky, under whose leadership such critical matters are not swept aside, but receive the due legal consideration they rightfully deserve. So who is this individual, who for many years masqueraded as an expert, while in reality systematically and deliberately advanced the strategic interests of specific Russian power structures on Ukrainian soil? The name of this individual is Iryna Kremenovska. Who is she, and how did the process of her infiltration into Ukraine's informational and legal landscape unfold? She is a Ukrainian citizen with a background in law. She is the founder of a pseudo-scientific project called the Center for Economic and Legal Research, the author and de facto editor of the portal Vine Slovo, Speak, and a listed coordinator and active contributor to the antisecta.org, an information partner of the Russian security services, operating under the guise of human rights protection. At first glance, she appears to be a civil society activist. In reality, she is one of the most persistent and dangerous operatives involved in the information psychological operation that Russian power circles have launched against Ukraine. Under the rhetoric of combating cults, a universal path to gain public trust, she concealed her true activities beneath the facade of protecting public safety and moral values. This is precisely how she gained the trust of journalists, officials from the Ministry of Internal Affairs, employees of the Security Service of Ukraine, and state-appointed experts. And it is no surprise, this method of infiltration has long been a standard practice of RACIRS operatives. It is actively employed across Europe, even in the United States and other countries. Under the guise of combating destructive cults, also known as totalitarian sects, agents of the Russian organization RACIRS gain access to information channels, influence the formation of expert assessments, and ultimately seize control over key topics in public discourse and administrative structures. Their Ukrainian operative, Kremenovska, replicated the terminology, rhetoric, and narrative structure of RACIRS' chief ideologue, Alexander Dvorkin, who has, in effect, created his own totalitarian sect grounded in an extremist and terrorist ideology aimed at suppressing the rights and freedoms of citizens, both within Russia and beyond its borders. Dvorkin is known for his ties to the FSB, as well as for a number of psychological disorders, which have nonetheless not prevented him from exerting influence over key governance structures in Russia and manipulating them to his will. Dvorkin and his primary platform, the Center of St. Iryna of Lyon, the official RACIRS website, are likewise notorious for their virulent anti-Ukrainian rhetoric and openly hateful narratives, targeting not only the president of Ukraine, but the entire Ukrainian nation. It is precisely this man, Dvorkin, who serves as the ideological mentor to Kremenovska. Her rhetoric is also closely aligned with that of RACIRS vice president, the Russian priest Alexander Novopashin, a vocal promoter of the narrative of neo-Nazism developing in Ukraine. His so-called religious work consists mainly of disseminating Russian propaganda designed to justify armed aggression. There is ample public evidence that Kremenovska is without question an agent of the Russian organization RACIRS, which is directly linked to the Russian Federal Security Service, FSB. A comprehensive linguistic analysis of Kremenovska's rhetoric in materials published on her media platform, Vilne Slovo, reveals a consistent overlap in language structures, terminological formulas, and thematic emphasis with those found in RACIRS affiliated media resources. This provides a well-founded basis for asserting that her communication strategy is shaped according to the directives of that very Russian entity. Specifically, in strict adherence to RACIRS' playbook, Kremenovska engages in the systematic discrediting of the same internationally recognized religious and civic organizations targeted by RACIRS. She also attacks leading Ukrainian religious scholars and human rights advocates, individuals who played a pivotal role in securing Ukraine's religious independence and in the recognition of the autocephaly of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, OCU. It was she who actively promoted labels such as sect lobbyist and agents of the West to discredit these figures, phrases that mirror the rhetoric of Russian Orthodox Church priest and RACIRS Vice President Alexander Novopashin, who used the exact same language to malign these respected religious scholars. Notably, the official website of Novopashin, the missionary department portal of the Novosibirsk Diocese, which operates under RACIRS, featured a glowing article about Kremenovska. The piece, reprinted from her own website, is written in an unmistakably celebratory tone and virtually lionizes her efforts in the so-called fight against cults, placing her alongside another Russian anti-cultist and vocal proponent of radical Russian propaganda. What is particularly striking is not just the content of the article itself, but the platform on which it was published. The Novopashin website, where Kremenovska is celebrated, is known for its consistent and virulent anti-Ukrainian rhetoric. Notably, it hosts a piece entitled "Ukraine is a Cult," in which Ukrainians are subjected to blatant dehumanization. That such an openly propagandistic and anti-Ukrainian Russian publication could so easily find an ally in a Ukrainian expert like Kremenovska speaks volumes about the true nature of her so-called educational activities in Ukraine. When it comes to the ideological foundation of Iryna Kremenovska's work, one revealing example stands out. On the official website of the Center for Economic and Legal Research, which she leads, there is a post announcing a project ostensibly aimed at assisting victims of so-called cults. Yet right there on that page, on the Ukrainian platform, and without any disguise, appears the slogan of RACIRS, the Russian organization led by Dvorkin, well known for its ties to the FSB and its active role in Russia's information psychological operations. This is a direct indicator that Kremenovska's ideological and methodological source is, in fact, the Russian agenda. Moreover, a look at the archived version of the antisecta.org website, where Kremenovska served as coordinator and one of its lead contributors, reveals that the site is saturated with quotations from Alexander Dvorkin and links to his articles and books. In the anti-cult fighters section of the site, Kremenovska's Ukrainian Center appears unabashed alongside RACIRS resources and figures known for their explicitly anti-Ukrainian stance. Kremenovska's rhetoric concerning the religious group Jehovah's Witnesses is also deeply revealing. Russia remains the only country in the world where this group has been officially designated as extremist and completely banned, a move initiated primarily by Dvorkin and widely condemned by the international community as a blatant violation of human rights and freedom of religion. Yet, Kremenovska, in her articles, praises this ban as a model of effective policy and openly expresses indignation that Ukraine has yet to follow Russia's example on this issue. Her writings on Jehovah's Witnesses include verbatim quotes from Dvorkin's public interviews, which she presents as her own analytical conclusions. Taken together, these elements form a clear picture. Kremenovska's actions do not merely align with the agenda of the Russian security services. They are explicitly grounded in that agenda as their ideological and methodological framework. It is imperative to note that on her own platforms, Kremenovska has openly encouraged Ukrainians to consult Russian websites and bloggers who directly promote an ideology aimed at the destruction of Ukrainian statehood. Her pages contain links to materials from authors who justify Russian aggression, propagate disinformation about Satanism in Ukraine, and call for the so-called denazification of Ukrainians, language that has long since crossed the threshold from the words to war crimes. It is difficult, to say the least, to believe that all this is mere coincidence, and yet it is precisely in such coincidences that the structure of RACIRS operations is laid bare. Covert influence, the disguise of public good, and a quiet yet methodical service to the enemy. Another defining trait of Kremenovska is her disturbing and sadistic involvement in dog hunting, a practice that in any civilized country provokes not just condemnation, but outright disgust. Together with a loyal accomplice, she even attempted to give this vile hobby a veneer of respectability by registering a so-called Journalist Dog Hunting Association. Presumably, this was meant to lend an air of legitimacy to their nighttime excursions to kill stray dogs. And although she no longer boasts about her exploits as loudly or as frequently, the internet thankfully does not forget. It preserves her own words, her confessions of how she, with sadistic delight, poisoned stray dogs and then comfortably seated by her window, listened to their dying howls, which she poetically described as serenades. Forgive me, Schubert, it seems you have a rival. Outraged residents of Kyiv and the surrounding region have repeatedly raised public outcries, demanding an end to this cruelty. Ukrainian media outlets have covered her acts of animal abuse on multiple occasions. And yet, regrettably, Kremenovska continues her grisly pursuits. This may well be explained by the fact that dog hunting, as a phenomenon, also originates in Russia, and her pro-Russian ideological alignment appears to extend to this particularly grotesque form of activism. What is particularly alarming is the role played by Kremenovska in the carefully orchestrated campaign to discredit the ALLATRA international public movement. Once certain circles in Russia realized that ALLATRA was promoting ideas fundamentally at odds with their interest, especially due to its public coverage of the Siberian magma plume threat, RACIRS quickly activated an information suppression strategy targeting ALLATRA. As part of the strategy, their agent of influence in Ukraine, Iryna Kremenovska, was deployed. Acting on direct orders from Moscow, she began methodically implementing an information warfare campaign aimed at discrediting ALLATRA, parroting word for word the language and rhetoric of the Russian sectarian ideologue Alexander Dvorkin and his RACIRS platform, which operates as a direct instrument of the FSB. Kremenovska copied and repeated Dvorkin's slanderous tropes against ALLATRA, totalitarian sect, cult, brainwashing, and fear manipulation. A linguistic analysis easily reveals that her sentence structures, terminology, and rhetorical constructs are identical to those used in Russian propaganda outlets and in Dvorkin's personal style. But of course, she did not stop at information terrorism. According to the Russian blueprint, this was merely the first phase. Over the course of 5 years, Kremenovska persistently attempted to initiate criminal proceedings against participants of ALLATRA. Fortunately, unlike in Russia, democracy in Ukraine still functions, and thank God there are individuals within the police, the Security Service of Ukraine, and the prosecutor's office who still possess a conscience. Despite her aggressive publications and efforts to exert pressure through public defamation, law enforcement officials refused to be drawn into baseless provocations. They did not initiate cases built on nothing, emotional outburst, or Moscow's propaganda manual. But in 2022, taking advantage of the chaos caused by Russia's full-scale military invasion of Ukraine and the imposition of martial law, Kremenovska finally achieved her objective. A criminal case was opened against participants of ALLATRA under the pretense of alleged ties to Russia. This is cynicism in its purest form. Kremenovska, a person who has consistently acted in the interest of Russia, accuses those very individuals of working for Russia, individuals who have been banned within Russia itself, whose organization has been declared undesirable, and whose scientific work directly contradicts the interest of Russian power circles. What's more, she personally constructed the case's evidentiary foundation by preparing so-called linguistic expert reports, entirely false and fabricated documents with no legal merit whatsoever, yet which served as the basis for the entire case. In these expert evaluations authored by Kremenovska herself, she preeminently embedded the narratives required to justify the predetermined verdict, accusing ALLATRA of so-called pro-Russian rhetoric. She deliberately chose this fabricated charge, knowing that during a time of war, it would be perceived as one of the gravest accusations possible. She was even brazen enough to publicly acknowledge her own role in launching the case and producing its expert reports, proudly declaring in her own website as if proud to have executed a Russian special operation. Think about that for a moment. A person operating entirely according to Russian playbooks and rhetoric initiates a criminal case against those who, on the contrary, are exposing the Russian threat. And she accuses them of sympathizing with Russia. This is no longer a paradox. This is absurdly elevated to the level of an institutional instrument. In essence, the operation carried out by Kremenovska is a weaponization of the legal system, a direct assault on Ukraine's national security, packaged in the style of FSB and RACIRS manuals. Its ultimate goal is to destroy the ALLATRA movement, whose work directly conflicts with the interest of the Russian power structures whose orders she is carrying out. And later in 2023, based on the same fabricated case, more than 70 searches were carried out in a single day, targeting participants of the ALLATRA movement. And here is what is truly alarming. Criminal proceedings against several ALLATRA participants remain open to this very day. This raises an obvious question. Why? There are at least two possible explanations. Either RACIRS agent Iryna Kremenovska was so effective in misleading Ukrainian law enforcement, skillfully manipulating trusted channels, and successfully presenting herself as an expert, Or perhaps even more intriguing, Ukrainian authorities deliberately gave her enough room to fully demonstrate her capabilities in order to trace the structure of her activities, uncover her networks, and identify methods of infiltration. Another important development, Kremenovska also initiated an administrative case aimed at banning the ALLATRA movement. The court was, to put it mildly, unimpressed with her so-called expert analysis. In its official ruling, the court stated that the submitted expert opinion could not be considered admissible evidence, as it was authored by a party with a vested interest in the outcome of the case. But that is not all. The same court ruling specifically noted that her materials contained pre-assembled formulations copied from internet sources, crafted to produce a predetermined outcome. In other words, the court effectively acknowledged that what she submitted was not a scientific evaluation, but a coercive tool designed to deliver a foregone result. It is important to emphasize that both the aforementioned administrative case and the ongoing criminal prosecution of ALLATRA participants are based entirely on these biased and agenda-driven expert analyses, authored by Kremenovska herself, which hold no legal merit whatsoever. However, the situation is finally beginning to receive the attention it actually deserves, both within the Ukraine and on the international stage. Thanks to the Security Service of Ukraine, Kremenovska's activities have finally been properly assessed by law enforcement authorities. A criminal case has been opened against her, a long overdue, entirely justified step. According to available information, the case has been initiated under a statute related to inciting interethnic and social hatred. But when one examines her actions over the past several years, their systematic nature and the harm she has consistently inflicted upon Ukraine, it becomes eminently clear that this is not merely a matter of incitement. What we are looking at instead bears all the hallmarks of Article 111 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine, high treason. There are simply too many coincidences to dismiss this as a mere expert's mistake. Her actions have been far too deliberate and too precisely aligned with the Russian methodology of informational and legal pressure. Thus, Iryna Kremenovska is not merely a journalist, an expert, or a civil society activist. She is, in fact, an operational asset in a long-term campaign aimed at undermining Ukraine's legal and informational stability. Her activities clearly violate the Constitution of Ukraine. They contradict European and international standards for the protection of freedom of conscience. They exhibit clear elements of high treason under Article 111 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine, including systematic dehumanization and the cultivation of hatred towards social and religious groups. Behind Kremenovska's polished slogans lies a structured campaign whose mission is to break the backbone of Ukraine's national security. And to build a truly democratic society, it is necessary to resist not only open enemies with weapons in their hands, but also covert agents armed with pens, keyboards, and a dubious expert status. The deeper tragedy of what is unfolding lies in the fact that Iryna Kremenovska, through her media publications, falsified expert reports, and the criminal prosecutions she initiated, has inflicted harm not only on a particular group of people or a Ukrainian society. In effect, she has actively obstructed the work of an international movement whose efforts are of critical importance to the future of the entire planet. This is not merely a Ukrainian issue. It is a matter that concerns every one of us, because the consequences of unchecked catastrophic events will reach all of us. ALLATRA is not simply a network of volunteers. It is a community of individuals, scientists, researchers, and kindred minds who have spent many years studying global climate and geodynamic processes, identifying hidden geophysical threats, including the Siberian magma plume, a phenomenon that represents an existential threat to humanity. If you recall, it was the participants of ALLATRA who, through their research, advanced our understanding of this phenomena and began developing practical responses, scientific, humanitarian, and cooperative. And it is precisely for this reason that they became a target, because their knowledge, engagement, and credibility stand in the way of a strategy built on silence, disinformation, and concealment. The truth about the Siberian plume is an inconvenient truth for certain power circles in Russia, those who fear its disclosure more than they fear any sanctions. Why? Because if people become aware of the reality of the Siberian plume's eruption risk, it could trigger a mass migration out of the country, leading to a workforce exodus, and as a result, massive personal financial losses for those very power holders. And because profit matters more to them than human life, they suppress any information about the reality of this threat. That is why RACIRS is doing everything it can to silence those who speak the truth about the Siberian plume, to destroy their reputations and disable their ability to act. In this context, Kremenovska is not merely an ideological agent. She is a tool used to actively undermine real efforts aimed at protecting society. She doesn't simply write articles. She engineers false legal narratives designed to paralyze operations, intimidate individuals, and destabilize critical initiatives. Every move she makes is one more step towards stripping humanity of its chance to defend itself against a planetary catastrophe. Today, we must speak plainly. This pseudo-expert campaign by RACIRS to discredit ALLATRA and its participants is, at its core, a war on the future. A war against those who could and should be helping the entire world. But as long as they are forced to defend themselves against false accusations, as long as they are deprived of the ability to carry out their work at full capacity, we are all losing time, and with it, our chances. This is why protecting these individuals and exposing figures like Kremenovska is no longer merely a matter of reputation or justice. Whether the world is able to expose agents like Kremenovska will determine whether we have a chance to prevent a catastrophe that can still be averted. This is not only about defending the integrity of the ALLATRA movement. It is not only about unmasking the RACIRS network. This is about safeguarding humanity's ability to respond to a challenge that nature itself has placed before us. Right now, we must not squander this vital opportunity to confront a geodynamic threat capable of destroying life on our planet. It is important to emphasize that under orders from Russian power structures, Kremenovska launched a particularly aggressive campaign against one specific participant of the ALLATRA movement. Everything we've discussed, criminal prosecutions, attacks on ALLATRA, expert reports copied verbatim from RACIRS methodology, was not merely an assault on an organization. It was a targeted operation aimed at neutralizing a single individual. From the very beginning, this individual was their primary target. This is the man whose name many around the world may not yet know, but to whom they already owe more than they can possibly imagine. The gentleman's name is Igor Danilov. Why him? Because it was Igor Danilov who 20 years ago was the first individual to identify the existence and impending activation of the Siberian magma plume, its location, its properties, its behavior, and its catastrophic potential. Over the next 10 years, the hypothesis he put forward was rigorously examined, re-examined, and tested by dozens of specialists across multiple disciplines, including a broad international team of geologists, geophysicists, geodynamicists, engineers, and climatologists. Everything he identified at that time has since been confirmed, and the inevitability of the threat has been verified. Within the work of the international research group of scientists that laid the foundation for the ALLATRA movement, a significant contribution belongs to Igor Mikhailovich Danilov. At the time, he was the only member of the scientific team who publicly acknowledged his involvement in this research, taking personal responsibility to speak openly and honestly about the essence of what was unfolding. Although Mr. Danilov does not hold a formal degree in geophysics, his extensive background in medicine, his deep understanding of interdisciplinary connections, his unconventional scientific approach, and his ability to identify causal relationships played a pivotal role in shaping the direction of the research. It was precisely thanks to his methodology that the scientific framework for studying climate and geodynamic processes was significantly expanded. His work also gave rise to new hypotheses, many of which are already being confirmed in practice and are now under serious discussion within expert circles. Thus, Mr. Danilov's contribution not only served as a starting point for a range of studies, but also exerted an invaluable influence on the scientific understanding of processes that today are directly linked to global security. His proposals made 2 decades ago became the foundation for the modern analytical model of Siberian Plume activation. Mr. Danilov is also the author of the initial schematic for potential degassing. This concept remains the only realistic strategy for preventing the catastrophic scenario of a Siberian Plume eruption. Unfortunately, the information and the man who brought it to light were met not with recognition, but with defamation and persecution. That is because certain figures within the Russian power structure are not interested in solving the problem of the Siberian magma plume. Their priority instead is preserving their financial assets and political influence. They understood one thing with clarity. If data on the plume's activation entered the international arena, it would pose a threat to their power, their wealth, and their strategic ambitions. Public exposure would consequently lead to contract renegotiations, enhanced political pressure, and a level of transparency they never aspired to. They realized that tomorrow they could lose billions. So they decided it would be far cheaper today to spend hundreds of millions discrediting one man. That is why a campaign was launched against Mr. Danilov. Once it became clear that he was right, those for whom the truth was inconvenient did everything in their power to ensure that no one would listen to him. That is how the discrediting campaign against ALLATRA began, through smear labels, manipulative media pieces, fabricated expert reports, criminal proceedings, and acts of dehumanization. It was a coordinated operation to neutralize Igor Danilov, a man who spent decades healing people, who developed his own therapeutic methodology, who helped thousands recover without surgery, was suddenly portrayed as a monster. The organization behind this campaign is the Russian RACIRS, and the person who personally coordinated and ideologically directed the entire operation was none other than Alexander Dvorkin, the so-called sectologist who has long served as a public mouthpiece and executor for the certain Russian power circles. However, Dvorkin could not act directly on Ukrainian territory. He needed a proxy inside the country. That proxy is Iryna Kremenovska. She assumed full responsibility for executing the technical and informational side of the operation to completely discredit Mr. Danilov within Ukraine's media space. Acting on behalf of RACIRS, she began compiling and disseminating slanderous, manipulative, and fabricated content designed to construct the image of a cult leader, a criminal, and a threat to society. She systematically distorted facts, ripped quotes out of context, and spread false narratives, adopting RACIRS playbooks to fit a Ukrainian audience. Through Kremenovska, the scenario they needed was carried out in Ukraine. First, destroy Mr. Danilov's reputation so that no one would dare defend him. Then escalate to physical attacks. Today, it can be said openly that there have been multiple assassination attempts on Mr. Danilov. He has spoken about them publicly without naming the orchestrators. But now, with all the actors exposed and the facts confirmed, I can state plainly, the assassination attempts on Igor Danilov were genuinely organized by entities connected to RACIRS and personally to Alexander Dvorkin. It was under their coordination that attempts were also made on my life as well. Yes, that is how far they're willing to go. Their goal is not simply to silence the truth. Their goal is to eliminate those who speak it. That is why they demonized Mr. Danilov, unleashed a campaign to destroy him, and did everything possible to ensure that the word ALLATRA no longer evoked science, but instead conjured slanderous labels and fear, so that no one would listen to what ALLATRA had to say. Why did they do it? And for what reason? Because when you threaten worlds that you know have been built on lies, then it is you that will become the target for destruction. That is why they are willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to uphold silence, so they could preserve their trillions. To prevent those false worlds from collapsing, the people had to remain in the dark, so that the citizens of Russia would continue living, working, and raising their children in the most dangerous place on earth, generating profit for them without ever realizing that they could perish at any moment. And so the script was set in motion. Destroy the source of information, discredit the scientific foundation, extinguish the voice. But truth cannot be killed. It can be silenced, slandered, distorted, but it will endure. Mr. Danilov is not just an individual. He is a chance for humanity to choose the path of reason and confront the threat of the Siberian magma plume through science, with scientific rigor and responsibility. You cannot imagine how many vital systems already depend on the ideas proposed by this one individual. Many of you, your children, your loved ones, already owe him for the time you still have. You may not have known his name before, but now you do. And when the time comes, you will know much more. And now it is time to turn to the second part of my address, one that is perhaps even more painful than everything I've said so far. What follows concerns the real and immediate danger posed to Ukraine, its land, its people, and its future. by the continued suppression of the Siberian Plume crisis and the proposed solution of degassing. As I have already mentioned, the exposure and resolution of this issue are being actively resisted by certain power circles in Russia, where the state-controlled media works diligently to cloak this threat in ridicule and disinformation, sedating public concern by blending truth with sheer absurdity and cultivating a toxic kind of apathy. As you now know, the same strategy is being executed in Ukraine, where agents under Russian coordination are engaged in discrediting ALLATRA participants, those who have called for open dialogue and have proposed viable pathways for addressing this existential threat. Now it will become clear why the suppression of this issue and of those prepared to address it is so dangerous for Ukraine itself. We will examine scientifically modeled scenarios of a rupture in the Siberian magma plume and analyze precisely how, in what forms, and at what scale Ukraine could suffer from its activation if the situation continues along its current trajectory, one defined by silence, international blindness, and the absence of a coordinated response to a very real danger threatening millions. A danger whose consequences will begin to be felt within the lifetime of the current generation. This is not about politics. This is about survival. If anyone still believes this threat concerns only Russia, that is a perilous illusion. Natural processes do not care for flags. Suppose the Siberian magma plume erupts suddenly and violently. In that case, the destructive force of that explosion will spare no corner of the planet. In the report on the threat of a magma plume eruption in Siberia and strategies for addressing the issue, ALLATRA scientists provide a detailed analysis of the global consequences of both a sudden and gradual eruption of the Siberian plume. To briefly summarize, in the event of a sudden rupture, 3 zones of destruction are projected. The central zone, with a radius of 150 kilometers, that is to say 95 miles, centered on the Putarana Plateau, would experience the formation of a massive crater and the instantaneous annihilation of all life due to the shock wave, impacting Russian cities such as Norilsk, Dudinka, and Talna. The intermediate impact zone, with a radius of 1,500 kilometers, that is to say 930 miles, would be engulfed by torrents of molten lava and gas traveling at speeds up to 700 kilometers per hour, consuming much of northern Siberia, including major urban centers. The outer zone would extend to a radius of approximately 9,000 kilometers, or 5,600 miles, where volcanic ash would blanket around 50% of the Earth's surface. This ash cloud would first spread over Russia, Asia, Europe, and North America, and within 7 to 10 days reach Australia, South America, and Antarctica. Ukraine lies approximately 3,300 to 4,000 kilometers from the epicenter, a distance that may seem vast at first glance, but is, in fact, close enough for the country to experience the full force of this magmatic cataclysm. The first warning will be picked up by seismic stations in the Carpathians. Sensitive instruments will detect unusual seismic activity long before the general population is aware of anything. Earthquakes with magnitudes up to 5 to 6 will sweep across the entire country, moving from east to west. The historic cities of western Ukraine will suffer damage from underground tremors, with medieval structures never designed to withstand seismic shocks, bearing the brunt of the destruction. In the eastern regions, seismic events will pose severe risks to industrial facilities, mining operations, and chemical plants. heightening the danger of technological disasters and ground collapses in populated areas. Within a day or two, residents across the country will begin noticing unusual atmospheric phenomena. Sunsets will take on an unprecedented intensity of color, crimson, violet, and deep orange hues. These will be the first visible signs of volcanic particles entering the upper layers of the atmosphere. Depending on wind direction, volcanic ash will begin to fall on Ukrainian territory within 2 to 4 days after the eruption. The northern and eastern regions, Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv Oblast, will be the first to feel the impact. Gradually, the ash cloud will spread across the entire country. By the end of the first week, Ukraine will be covered with a gray-black layer measuring 30 to 50 centimeters thick. The agricultural regions of central Ukraine, often referred to as the breadbasket of Europe, will experience rapid soil degradation. Fertile black soils, formed over millennia, will be buried under a toxic layer that will render crop cultivation impossible for several thousand years to come. The seeded fields of Poltava, Kherson, and Vinnytsia will turn into ashen waste fields, and recently sprouted crops will perish beneath the abrasive layer. As soon as ashfall begins, the country's transportation infrastructure will begin to fail. All modes of transport will grind to an absolute halt as engines rapidly break down. Volcanic ash, once drawn into the cylinders, acts as an abrasive, destroying metal components. Ukraine's energy sector will enter a severe crisis. Nuclear power plants Zaporizhzhia, Rivne, Metnishki in South Ukraine will be forced to drastically reduce electricity production. Coal-fired thermal power stations will encounter fuel contamination and filter blockages, leading to widespread shutdowns. A few weeks after the onset of the catastrophe, Ukraine will begin to experience acid rain. The combination of volcanic gases with atmospheric moisture will produce highly acidic precipitation that will corrode metal structures, erode stone buildings, and degrade asphalt roads. Traditional agriculture will become impossible due to soil and water contamination, as well as a sharp temperature drop. Livestock and poultry will begin to die en masse from ingesting volcanic ash while grazing or drinking contaminated water. Households that rely on subsistence farming will face the threat of famine. The country's ecosystems will enter a phase of rapid and dramatic collapse. Ukraine's unique nature reserves will begin to lose biodiversity at an accelerated pace. With each passing day, the sky will grow darker. What scientists refer to as volcanic night will set in, a period when the stratosphere becomes so saturated with ash that sunlight can barely penetrate. As the volcanic night sets in, the entire territory of Ukraine will be plunged into twilight, resembling an extended winter dusk. Sunlight barely filtering through the ash-laden upper atmosphere will produce a dim, diffuse glow, making it difficult to distinguish colors or judge distances. The psychological toll of this phenomenon on the population will be no less devastating than its physical consequences. Ukraine's healthcare system, already strained by wartime conditions, will be unable to cope with the surge of patients suffering from respiratory illnesses. Individuals with chronic conditions who depend on regular medication or specialized treatment will find themselves in an especially vulnerable position. Respirators may offer limited protection from ash in the initial months following a rupture of the Siberian magma plume. Still, they will be entirely useless against the climatic upheaval that follows. Ukraine's climate will undergo catastrophic transformation, due to a supervolcanic winter, during which sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere will block the majority of incoming solar radiation. Within months, temperatures across the country will drop by 24 to 31 degrees Celsius, below historical norms. Ukraine, located in the temperate climate zone and renowned for its fertile soils, will face conditions resembling the Arctic even during summer. Winter temperatures could fall to negative 50 degrees Celsius in the north and negative 40 degrees Celsius in the south. Even in summer, temperatures will rarely rise above freezing. The country's major waterways, the Dnipro, Dniester, Southern Bull, and Seversky Donets, will freeze solid to their depths. The Dnipro cascade of hydraulic power stations will cease to operate. Water intake for cities and industrial facilities will become impossible. The Black Sea, which has never fully frozen in recorded history, will begin to ice over along the shores of Odessa, Kherson, and Crimea. Such an extreme temperature anomaly will render the territory of Ukraine virtually unsuitable for traditional agriculture and most forms of human activity without specialized shelters. Under such conditions, survival will be possible only for those with access to secure shelters, equipped with autonomous life support systems, food reserves, and medical supplies. However, even the very best prepared groups will eventually face resource exhaustion, as the duration of a supervolcanic winter could span centuries or even millennia. The same scenario awaits the nations of Europe and the entire Eurasian continent. The consequences for the rest of the world will be even more devastating. Within the first few days, global air traffic will come to an absolute halt due to ash clouds saturating the atmosphere. The disruption of global logistics, massive ashfall, and the breakdown of agricultural supply chains will trigger a worldwide food crisis. Many countries will face an energy shortage, leading to economic shocks and political instability. The global economy will collapse under the weight of these cascading events, setting off a chain reaction of financial and social crises. A sudden temperature drop of 24 to 31 degrees Celsius, acid rain, and severe soil contamination will decimate agriculture not only across Eurasia, but throughout the entire world. Billions of people and animals will perish within the first year, victims of starvation, water scarcity, toxic air, and rapid climate destabilization. In the decades that follow, the ongoing eruption of the Siberian magma plume will bring even more devastating consequences. The framework of global civilization will collapse, and at least 99% of humanity will perish due to the extreme conditions. Humanity will lose most of its modern technologies and accumulated knowledge, plunging into a profound regression in development. Let us now consider an alternative scenario, a slow eruption of the Siberian magma plume, in which lava would gradually break through the Earth's crust over the course of centuries, allowing for the possibility of survival during the first year in parts of Ukraine and the outer regions of Russia. Even under such conditions, the prolonged release of lava across Siberia would trigger catastrophic long-term consequences that would reshape the planet for thousands of years. The atmosphere would become saturated with toxic substances, leading to planet-wide acid rain and the breakdown of the ozone layer. The oceans would begin to acidify to critical levels, resulting in the mass extinction of marine life. On land, the extinction of terrestrial species would become inevitable due to a toxic atmosphere, the collapse of soil ecosystems, and the disappearance of most plant life. The death of pollinators would bring about the complete collapse of ecosystems. a mass extinction event would occur, affecting 75 to 95% of all living species, just as it did 250 million years ago. In any scenario, an eruption of the Siberian magma plume will trigger a global climate, biological, and geological crisis that will fundamentally restructure Earth's biosphere and lead to a mass death of humans and a vast portion of modern species. It will mark the end of civilization as we now know it and reset life on the planet. The scale of this catastrophe will surpass all known historical events. It will be comparable only to the greatest extinction events in Earth's history, initiating a new evolutionary cycle thousands of years from now. In my previous video, I explained, almost as if speaking to children, the necessity of degassing the Siberian magma plume and how such action could reduce geodynamic pressure across the entire Earth's crust. However, it seems that some critical points may have been misunderstood. You already saw the example I gave last time with the blue balloon, but let's go deeper. Pressure is continuously building in the depths of our planet, yet controlled degassing of the Siberian magma plume has not been conducted. That means no systematic release or redirection of gases and magma has taken place. No gradual venting to relieve the internal pressure within Earth's magmatic system. And this is precisely why the number of powerful earthquakes is increasing. The Earth's crust is quite literally tearing at its seams, strained from within by superheated magma. The devastating earthquakes we've witnessed around the world over the past decade are direct evidence of this. They are not random, they are inevitable. When pressure builds within a closed system, it eventually begins to crack. Our planet is like a balloon coated in hardened glaze, steadily swelling from within. I've previously drawn your attention to the seismic event in Miramar on March 28th, which registered a magnitude of 7.7, and according to some reports, even 7.9. This was an unusual phenomenon known as super shear rupture, in which energy is released at an extraordinary rate. In such events, the rupture front moves faster than the seismic waves themselves, creating a concentrated shock wave of energy. How can I explain, using our balloon analogy, why the super shear rupture occurred? Imagine an inflatable balloon with a rigid outer shell of varying thickness, say made from dense latex. Now begin inflating the balloon. What happens? The balloon doesn't expand evenly. In some areas, the shell stretches more than others, accumulating internal stress. And when the pressure in one of those stressed regions exceeds the material's threshold, there's a sudden explosive rupture. Not a slow tear, but a violent, ultra-fast break accompanied by a massive release of energy. This is precisely how the Earth's crust behave. It is highly irregular, varying in thickness, density, and composition. And like our balloon, it begins to rupture unevenly under pressure. The Miramar earthquake is a clear, real-world example of exactly this kind of rupture. All of this is happening because the planned degassing of the Siberian magma plume has not yet been carried out. The excess volume of magma remains trapped within a closed system. Pressure in the Earth's interior continues to rise, driving the exponential increase in both the frequency and intensity of earthquakes. As I've said before, and I'll repeat myself, we will continue to see more and more abnormal shifts, atypical ruptures, thrust, and uplifts all around the world, day after day. On this note, a number of important news stories emerged in early April that I'd like to comment on. The first came out of Japan, where a government task force revised its damage assessment for the anticipated mega earthquake along the Nankai Trail off Japan's Pacific coast. The new projection estimates that a magnitude 9.0 earthquake could claim approximately 298,000 lives. Japanese seismologists report that the probability of such an event occurring within the next 30 years is around 80%. The government is now modeling three-dimensional simulations to visualize the expected impacts of this disaster. You're seeing one of those simulations on your screen right now. According to the Japanese scientists' report, the projected economic damage from this anticipated catastrophe is approximately 270.3 trillion yen, twice the size of Japan's national budget. ALLATRA scientists warned about the threat of this earthquake many years ago. Japanese experts explain why the government is now paying particular attention to the Nankai Trough. They say it's primarily due to the Great East Japan earthquake. When that earthquake struck in 2011, its scale far exceeded what anyone in Japan had anticipated. That event triggered concerns within the government that they may be underestimating the threat posed by the Nankai Trough. But I will tell you what they are not factoring in. It's the Siberian magma plume. What they're overlooking is just how significantly the risk of a catastrophic earthquake in Japan increases due to the fact that controlled, planned degassing of the Siberian plume has still not been carried out. It seems they find it easier to calculate the projected losses, hundreds of trillions of yen and hundreds of thousands of lives, than to assess the benefits of implementing a controlled and systematic degassing of the plume in Siberia. Also, at the end of March this year, a team of Chinese seismologists published a peer-reviewed study warning of an increase in risk of devastating earthquakes, similar to the one that struck Myanmar on March 28, but this time in the region of the Tibetan Plateau and surrounding areas of China. The researchers also identified correlations between seismic activity cycles and changes in Earth's rotational speed. The study was widely covered in the media. Reports noted that the study led by senior engineer Zhu Hongbin of the Beijing Seismological Bureau was published on March 20th in the Journal of Geodesy and Geodynamics, an academic journal issued by the China Earthquake Administration. The region may now be entering the early stage of a new period of seismic activity, Zhu's team wrote. Unfortunately, that study has since disappeared from public access. This group of Chinese experts had done important work. After all, the earthquake in Myanmar occurred during a transitional phase in Earth's daily rotational speed. That incorporated Earth's rotation into their analysis. But what they failed to account for was the most critical factor of all, the pressure building within the planet's interior, driven by the Siberian magma plume. Once again, I must emphasize that the balloon is bursting at its seams because the pressure within Earth's interior continues to rise. What can I say in this regard? The San Andreas Fault, right here in the United States, also shows clear signs of an impending catastrophic super shear rupture. The countries that have already suffered will continue to experience devastating earthquakes. In Japan and China, Myanmar and Thailand, Turkey and Syria, Afghanistan and Morocco, Bolivia and Chile, these powerful destructive earthquakes are all occurring because a controlled degassing of the Siberian magma plume has not been carried out in time. Now that you fully understand that a series of powerful earthquakes that have claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, could have been prevented had the Siberian magma plume been degassed in advance, you begin to grasp the magnitude of the opportunity humanity has actually missed. We are talking about a scientifically grounded approach capable of reducing pressure in Earth's interior and halting the cascading geodynamic processes that lead to catastrophic events. This solution is still within reach. Our lives can still be saved, but the window of opportunity is not infinite. The problem is this: those who speak out about this issue, openly, honestly, and who offer a concrete solution supported by years of scientific research and data are facing repression. These individuals are silenced, discredited, prosecuted, and in some cases threatened and even targeted for assassination. And in this atmosphere of fear, suppression, and defamation, how are these people expected to continue their work? How are they to research, to inform, to warn when everything around them is designed to stop them? And yet they do not stop. The participants of the ALLATRA International Public Movement are courageous scientists, researchers, and volunteers, people of extraordinary inner strength and unwavering commitment. In the face of overwhelming pressure and adversity, they persist. They continue trying to reach out, to explain, to substantiate the truth. They keep going for the future of all of us. Some of you listening closely right now may feel a natural and entirely justified inner response. How can this be? Why is no one listening? How can a threat to all humanity be ignored? Something must be done, and urgently. If you're feeling that, take it as a good sign. It means your conscience is actually alive. It means you still carry within you a sense of justice and responsibility. But I must warn you, do not fall into illusions. Try a simple personal experiment. Just observe your own consciousness over the next 2 days after hearing everything shared herein about the reality of the Siberian Plume, the threat of its eruption, and the very real possibilities for solving it. You'll likely discover something both astonishing and deeply troubling. Within 2 days, this information, so urgent and vivid today, will begin to fade. The sense of immediacy will dull. Your attention will shift. The impulse to act will dissolve. What now feels crystal clear will start to seem distant, abstract, like something that doesn't concern you. This is not your fault. It is a mechanism built into the human psyche. When a person is confronted with a traumatic truth, especially one of global magnitude, the mind instinctively moves to shield itself from the psychological strain. It suppresses the knowledge, buries the threat, and pushes it out of conscious awareness, whispering, "Later, not now, not my concern." And herein lies one of the primary causes of global silence. This is why so many people resist hearing the bitter truth, let alone sharing it. It is a form of psychological paralysis. Until we as a society recognize this internal mechanism and learn to confront it, even the most vital knowledge and the most urgent scientific warnings will continue to disappear from public consciousness before they ever become action. This mental suppression is triggered by fear. Fear that the threat is not theoretical but real. Not distant but near. Not tomorrow but now. The human mind resists embracing new worldview because to do so would demand change. But when catastrophe finally comes, when the blow of disaster strikes, these very same people will cry out, "Why? Why is this happening to us?" The answer is painfully simple: because we failed to act when we still could have, because we did not speak, because we chose not to hear. In those moments, it is not the threat itself, but our fear of the truth that becomes the actual cause of tragedy. And yet, humanity still has a chance. We have scientific knowledge. We have technological solutions. And most importantly, we have evidence that can no longer be ignored. But the paradox is this. The moment everything becomes proven and clear, that is when resistance reaches its peak. People begin to lose the information. It burns out in their minds precisely because of fear. Fear of change. Fear of truth. Fear of personal responsibility. And so we hear the familiar refrain, "You go ahead and save the world. We'll stand by and watch. See how it turns out." The problem is not a lack of solutions. The problem is that human consciousness resists looking into the face of a future that may be lost. That fear turns into passivity and detachment. People then ask, "How can we help you?" But they fail to understand that survival is not a service to be delegated to others. It is a responsibility, one that falls on each and every person, because there is no one else. And if you do not act today, no one will come in your place. Allow me to offer a comparison that, in my view, accurately captures both the threat of the Siberian magma plume and the public's current response to it. Imagine this. A massive asteroid, hundreds of kilometers in diameter, is hurtling towards Earth. Its size is such that if it were to strike, it would wipe out not only Russia and Ukraine, but entire continents, causing irreversible consequences for the entire planet. Its trajectory is known. Scientists have calculated where and when it will hit, and they understand that time is running out. And yet, for some reason, no one acts. People look away, comforting themselves with the thought, maybe it will miss us, or let someone else deal with it. And this, despite the fact that humanity possesses everything needed to avert the catastrophe. We have the technology, the knowledge, the experts. What's missing, however, is one thing, a collective decision and the will to act. This is precisely the logic unfolding today in the case of the Siberian magma plume. The only difference is that this threat isn't descending from the sky. It's rising from the depths of the earth. However, in terms of consequences, it is no less destructive than an asteroid impact. The activation of the Siberian magma plume could trigger devastation on a planetary scale, abrupt climate shifts, and mass casualties. And just like with the asteroid, we have real actionable methods to eliminate the threat, specifically through degassing technologies. These are engineering solutions that can be implemented right now. But we are confronted with the very same paradox. Despite having the knowledge and still having time, no action is being taken. Worse still, those who attempt to speak about the threat are discredited, and the topic itself is deliberately pushed out of the public and political discourse. Not because the threat is unprovable, but because acknowledging it demands decisive action. And action means responsibility, resources, and attention. Yes, for many, it is easier to disengage. Fear sets in, followed by inner resistance. I don't know what to do. I'm not a scientist. This isn't my responsibility. But that is the trap. An asteroid won't fall on just one person. It won't distinguish between those who understand and those who didn't, between those who believed and those who laughed. It will strike everyone. If we fail to communicate this information to those in positions to make decisions, if we don't unite and use the opportunity humanity still has, that impact will become inevitable. This is why it is so vital to speak openly about it. Because once the asteroid is already in the atmosphere, it's too late to argue about which report first mentioned its orbit. We must act now, and we must speak, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. Responsibility to ourselves, to one another, and to the generations to come. But how exactly am I supposed to act? You may ask yourselves. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a politician. I don't know how to carry out degassing. What good can I possibly do? At first glance, that may seem like a reasonable question, but it is here that we find one of the most dangerous misconceptions, a misconception we as a society must overcome. The impact of each individual is enormous. It is through your voice, your attention, and your involvement that those who truly hold the power to act, those who can initiate the process of degassing, those upon whom the fate of millions depend, can hear and may find the courage to act. We are fully aware that the Siberian region in question is one of the most economically critical areas in Russia. It is under the control of powerful interest. It is a territory where any interference in the established order threatens the existing balance of power and capital. That is why this information encounters such fierce resistance. That is why certain forces are doing everything in their power to ensure that this information, pure, factual, and truthful, never reaches the decision-maker's desk. Today, the most dangerous aspect of the Siberian Plume crisis is not that it is unsolvable, it's that someone benefits from not solving it. And for that reason, it is deliberately silenced, even at the highest levels. Had this threat been located in another country, a more open and accountable one, the solution might have already been in motion. However, nature does not recognize political borders, elite interest, or economic structures. It operates on its own laws. It is as if nature played a cruel joke, choosing as its critical pressure point a region located within a country where, for political and economic reasons, implementing a solution is the most difficult. The power structures in Russia that are deeply vested in keeping the threat of the Siberian magma plume from being acknowledged at the official level possess a wide array of influential tools, including the creation of entire organizations, through which they maintain control over the expert community. As a result, within this environment, whose opinion directly affects decision-making, there is no genuine scientific discourse. Instead, the space is dominated by so-called pseudo-experts whose role is to block discussion of fundamental problems and replace it with manufactured narratives. The most telling example of this manipulation is the activity of Dvorkin's cult and his organization, RACIRS. Their agents are deliberately embedded in expert circles, shaping the opinions of decision-makers not through objective analysis, but based on instructions driven by private interest, replacing reality with interpretations tailored to their specific agenda. In such a context, there is a very real danger that even politicians who may want to act will never receive an accurate picture of what is truly happening. The information that reaches them is filtered through a distorted lens, typically embracing deliberately constructed pseudo-expertise. Figures like Vinogradov and other cultists aligned with Dvorkin's agenda flood policymakers and public officials with their narratives and assessments which have absolutely no basis in reality. Here we arrive at a fundamental question. How, under these conditions, can those responsible for making critical decisions gain access to genuinely real information, and not the fiction with which they are deliberately surrounded by actors pursuing their own interest? The answer is vividly clear. Only through the people. Because politics is not an isolated system. It is a mechanism that reflects the will of society. Or at very least, that is how it is meant to function in most civilized nations. Politicians begin to act when they hear a clear, well-articulated demand from the public. If society declares that it wants to live, that becomes a line in the sand, one that cannot be ignored. But if society remains silent, it signals an internal acceptance of what is happening. In that case, it is only natural for politicians to act accordingly. That is precisely why raising awareness is today the only viable path forward. When people know, public opinion begins to form. And once public opinion exists, politicians are compelled to respond. Because if everything continues to be concealed, if reports and expert assessments remain falsified, as they already have, then the opportunity will be lost. Believe me, we truly have everything we need. We have analytical resources, scientifically grounded data, and realistic technical solutions that, given today's level of scientific and technological advancement, can already be implemented and are capable of altering the geodynamic situation. The threat posed by the Siberian magma plume can be resolved. This is why your personal involvement becomes absolutely critical. To share this with others, to ensure the information does not fade, does not disappear, does not get erased from memory. Only when people know does public opinion begin to take shape. And public opinion is no longer just words. It is leverage. It is power. And that power now rests in the hands of those who, for the moment, are simply listening to me. You, the people who listen to me, are parents, brothers, sisters, children. You are the ones who can protect the people you love. You are the only ones who can preserve a future for the children, because sooner or later, each of us will have to answer one simple, outstanding question. What did you do when you knew? And may each of us be able to say, I did everything I could for humanity, for my family, for life itself. Life is worth fighting for.